Hello, and welcome to Breast Cancer Conversations, a podcast brought to you by survivingbreastcancer.org. I am Laura Carfing, breast cancer survivor and founder of survivingbreastcancer.org, a nonprofit organization providing community, education, and resources to empower those diagnosed with breast cancer and their caregivers from day one and beyond. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of Breast Cancer Conversations. I am so excited to introduce you to Dr. James C. Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a licensed psychologist and neuropsychologist and a leading expert on the impact of illness on mental health. He serves as the Director of Rehabilitation and Recovery at the Critical Illness, Brain Dysfunction, and Survivorship Center at Vanderbilt, where his work focuses on supporting people living with life-threatening and chronic medical conditions. Together, we are exploring what medical trauma really means and how it can show up during our diagnosis, treatment, into survivorship, and caregiving, and why difficult medical experiences can leave an emotional mark long after appointments and procedures are over. We also talk about the fact that cancer is not an individual sport. It affects everybody around us. Today's episode is thoughtful, validating, and incredibly important conversation about what it means to move through cancer, chronic illness, fear, uncertainty, and healing, and how we begin to reclaim parts of ourselves along the way. So whether you've been newly diagnosed, in active treatment, living with metastatic disease, years into survivorship, or supporting someone you love through cancer, I hope this episode helps you feel seen, understood, and a little less alone. Welcome to the conversation.
I'm Jim Jackson. I'm a psychologist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. I've been here for almost a quarter of a century now. That is odd to say. I'm bald now, used to have some hair, so I'm getting old. But one of the things I've learned over the past 25 years is that trauma is not just combat. Trauma is not just sexual assault. It is those things, to be sure. It's certainly those things. But I've learned that it is much more than that. It includes a range of medical concerns. It includes a range of medical illnesses, surgeries. It includes cancer, as you know. And that term medical trauma that you alluded to, it is a term that a lot of people have arrived at. They've arrived at that term because it fits their experience. They don't know what else to call what they're going through except a trauma. They don't know what else to call it because it feels like a trauma. It looks like a trauma. I think we should be honest and say in many cases it actually is a trauma.
Can you tell me about the history or the evolution of the term medical PTSD or medical trauma?
When I pitched the idea to an agent and a publisher of writing a book about medical trauma, this was 2.5 years ago, I thought it was a great idea. I think it is, but I thought it was a great idea. But I thought, surely someone has written a book on medical trauma. Like I'm probably late to the party, like I often have been in my research career. Someone has written a book on trauma, medical trauma. And as I explored it, no one actually had written a book on medical trauma. There was a book for practitioners, very helpful, but nothing for patients, nothing patient-facing at all. And I think that highlighted, as recently as 3 years ago, how little that term was used. You can find it in the literature. You can find the term medical PTSD in particular in the literature dating back probably 20 years or so. But that term medical PTSD in particular, the term that had been used more widely, I think is a little misleading because the point is people who experience medical trauma, they may experience PTSD, but that's not the only thing they experience. They can develop anxiety, they can develop depression, they can develop OCD, they can have a huge array of problems, and often they do. So I prefer the term medical trauma. And again, it's new. It's 20 years old, I think. What might be a trauma to me might not be to you or vice versa. It's a little bit of a complicated question. But in general, I define it as emotional or cognitive distress. Trauma has some cognitive consequences for sure. Emotional or cognitive distress that develops after difficult medical illnesses, experiences, encounters. I mention experiences and encounters because sometimes it isn't just the cancer in our case that is traumatic. It can be the experience of being dismissed by a well-meaning oncologist, right? Or a GP or a radiologist who says, really not sure why you're so worried about this scan. It's going to be fine. And I think people interpret that as incredibly demeaning, and that can be traumatic. So it's a broad definition intentionally because I think this is a big net. This is a big net that covers a huge range of people. In my judgment, medical trauma impacts millions of people around the world. That doesn't mean that millions of people develop PTSD, but it does mean, I think, that millions of people have the experience of encountering something difficult in the medical arena that leaves a mark. Often it's an invisible mark, unfortunately or fortunately. Often it's an invisible mark, and people don't know that you're carrying this burden around with you, but you are, and often you're carrying it for a very long time.
Thank you. I appreciate that broad definition because it can encompass so many facets of what we're experiencing. I remember when I was going through chemotherapy, it was weekly treatments, and just like gearing up for going into an infusion center, knowing I was going to be giving myself very toxic chemicals, gave me this visceral like anxiety and like upset stomach and just all of these like symptoms, like both very physical symptoms of, oh gosh, I am willingly walking myself into this situation to hopefully beat the cancer, but then also know that I'm giving myself drugs that can cause, cardiac disease later down the line, osteopenia down the line, all of these other traumas, if you will, that I have to look out for. Yes, we're focused on the cancer, but then there's survivorship and the long-term effects of what it is that we're going through too.
It's a very complicated process. And I think, as you noted, it isn't only the cancer. It often is the bundle that surrounds it that can be traumatic. The other thing that I found, I used to see this at the VA when I saw combat veterans a lot. Over there, occasionally, I would see someone who had an exposure to what I thought was a profound trauma, and they were fine. And occasionally, I'd see someone who was exposed to what I thought was quite a small trauma, and they were certainly not fine, right? Their life was turned on its head. So I think we need to really be careful in the way we assess this trauma, and recognize that sometimes something that doesn't feel traumatic can be very traumatic. Equally, some people breeze through some things that we're not sure how they could handle. They're handling them. So the point is, there are all these paradoxes. And as healthcare providers, we need to lean in and say, are you okay? Like, I may not think that this should be impacting you much, but I shouldn't assume that because it can impact you a great deal. And that's the guidance, I think, that I always give to healthcare providers. Don't assume, right? Like, lean in, check in, empower. Don't assume that people are fine just because you think this actually isn't that big of a deal. Well, you don't know the story of that person who's walking into your clinic. You don't know the history of their trauma. You don't know what could be profoundly triggering. So be compassionate and be curious and don't make assumptions.
I was talking to a woman yesterday and we were discussing the spectrum of treatments people go through with cancer. And this particular individual did not need to have chemotherapy. And in our conversation, it took her a long time to realize that she still went through cancer and that her story was valid and still traumatic, to use this term. But she also had this perspective of like less than, or that she didn't suffer enough, or she didn't have to go through it. She had it, quote unquote, easier than some other people, which diminishes her experience a little bit. But this was self-imposed. And so, how do we help others know, and to your point exactly, like, something could be catastrophic and they could be okay. Something could be much smaller and triggering. So how do we normalize and validate people's experiences? I want to take a quick moment and tell you something I'm really excited about. You can now download the survivingbreastcancer.org app directly from the App Store or Google Play. Just search for survivingbreastcancer.org. It is completely free to download, and inside you will have access to all of our support groups, educational programs and webinars, all of our blog content and articles, podcast episodes, and community features to connect with others who understand what you're going through. Everything in one place, because navigating breast cancer shouldn't require 15 open browser tabs. Download the app today.
It's a really great question. I've got a lot of psychological interventions that I use, that other psychologists use. Of course, they have a huge menu of things to do. But one of the things for me that has been the most powerful, even transformative for patients and in my own life, is simply removing the word but and adding the word and, right? Put and where but was. And that puts things together as opposed to separate them, in the vein of her cancer was really hard, and and mine was maybe less hard than hers, and it's still really hard, right? Or our experiences were different, and mine was still hard, right? Like holding that together, right? Like acknowledging two things can be true, right? Like somebody could be sicker than you, sure, and that doesn't mean that your experience isn't really difficult, right? So holding those things together, I think very often we separate things instead of integrating them. And what I always encourage people to do is to take a more integrated approach, right? Yes, her cancer was objectively worse than yours. Sure. She spent 3 weeks in the hospital. You only spent one. And your story is valid on its own merits. And you're worthy of care and love and concern and support. We could keep adding things. And you're worth the treatment that you're getting. That's really important, adding and instead of but.
When these experiences come to light, they can come at different moments in someone's experience with cancer. So earlier I was talking about, the when you're in treatment and you're going to the hospital, smells, sounds, locations can be very triggering and cause these like physical anxiety moments. Also, another point in my personal experience was when I was returning back to work, or even getting to a milestone of, 1 year cancer anniversary, or 5 years out from my diagnosis. And sometimes, now that I've had breathing room, so to speak, to process what I've gone through as an early stage person with breast cancer, it kind of almost hits harder afterwards.
Yeah, I agree. I very much agree with that. And I think the dynamic is that often when you're in the middle of it, you're in survival mode, right? You're maybe not in reflective mode, you're in survival mode. And sometimes it's only after you've left that survival mode that you step out and you survey the field and you reflect. And only then do you think, oh my gosh, I can't believe what I've gone through, right? I can't believe how disruptive this has been. I can't believe how painful it has been. And sometimes when that happens, the weight of that hits you like a ton of bricks, and it's really overwhelming. And often, in my experience, those moments when it hits often come quite out of the blue because, when you're done with that course of chemotherapy, there's often an element of, okay, I've made it. I'm okay. And it's almost like a hand reaches out and grabs you and pulls you back as you're having a tearful breakdown on the way to the hospital after you've been cleared, thinking, what on earth is happening? Well, often it's the buildup of a lot of emotions that you didn't have the luxury of processing. And now they're hitting you with real force.
Yeah, my husband loves to tell this story of me driving to work one day, and I'm on 90 going west, heading out to my job. Beautiful sunny day, like cobalt blue skies, no traffic, birds, etc. And I just start like bawling in the car. Like, don't know what triggered it. I call him on speakerphone. He was like, pull over. And like my mascara is running. I'm like, how can I go to work? My makeup is running, all these things. He's like, snap a picture and let your community know. And it was amazing that like in real time, everyone was responding, the power of like technology and social media and all of these things for people to be like, oh my gosh, that was me last week, or I felt the same way. And you have these emotions that do get bottled up and decide to show up in the most inconvenient times, but to kind of embrace that, like, I don't know, ugly girl cry of like, gosh, this was really hard. I don't really know what's happening, but my body is releasing something.
It's part of your story. And this is the and instead of but. And even as it's hard, the ugly girl cry, even as it is unattractive by some standard, perhaps, it's also beautiful, right? I mean, it's also really lovely. And the other thing that you said that I think is so important, we should return to it in these conversations again and again and again, is you had a community of people, you sent a picture to this community of people. And there aren't that many things in my work professionally that I would say are always true, but there's at least one, and that is when people are going through cancer or whatever the illness is, if they have a robust community around them, they do better. They do better. And if they have a less robust community, they do worse. That's almost always true. And it's no simple thing to build a community if you don't have one, but there are ways to do that. There are ways to do that. And the key, I think, is recognizing it's important, right? Like dealing with cancer and the effects of cancer trauma. This is not an individual sport, right? Like this is a team sport. It really does take a village. And if you don't have people surrounding you, you need to find them, right? And those people could be, the girl that you grew up with across the street who you're friends with in high school and you lost touch, but you believe that if you called her, she would take the call, right? Or those people that community might be strangers that attend a church across the street from your new neighborhood and you've never walked in the door because you're not religious, but you don't need to be, right? Like maybe there are a group of people that can support you. So finding that community is vitally important because, as you well know, if you try to cope with this alone, it's going to be really difficult for you and also really for your family.
I don't want to lose sight of the role of the family, the support system, the caregiver, the care partner, who is also trying to be incredibly strong for the person. I'll use my husband in this case, who was incredibly strong for me, but also had these moments of watching the pain that his loved person is going through. And how do we support that psychological trauma that the caregiver, the family, or the children might be experiencing?
I think it's a great question. I think we start with the acknowledgement that it is a trauma for them, can be a trauma for them, and everything I think flows from there. If you look at ICU survivors now, some of them are in the ICU due to cancer-related effects, some are not. But if you look at ICU survivors, a population I've worked with for many years, their family members have rates of PTSD that are at least as high, and in some studies higher than in patients, even higher than in patients. And when I realized that this French critical care physician wrote a paper about this maybe 20 years ago, when I first realized this, I was really shocked, but it holds true. And part of it is, as the patient is sort of immersed in survival, the husband or the wife is standing on the edge of things, just watching this sometimes train wreck unfold in real time, right? And it's terrifying. And they're reflecting on things like, how am I going to care for our daughter if my wife's not around, right? And they're reflecting on things like, gosh, I don't feel like I have the luxury of not holding it together. So I'm going to bottle it up and I'm going to try to be as strong as I can. And that's going to take a huge toll, right? And if I'm feeling sad, I'm going to try really hard not to share it because I'm afraid that you're going to be more sad, right? So it's a hard spot to be in. I've often interacted with patients where it's often the husband who says, I've got to be strong. I can't cry. I feel like it. I can't. And I have all often said, well, dip your toe in the water. The water's fine, right? Like let's try, right? And the response often is, well, my wife will be sad. And my response is, you guys can bond around those tears. You can be sad together. You can bond around those tears. And that's going to make you strong. Excuse me. That's going to make you stronger than bottling it all up, which feels appealing, I think, to many men. But I think it's exactly the wrong strategy.
I had another anecdotal story where a woman was talking to her husband, like, you never cried for me. You never said this was hard for you. Like I felt alone and abandoned.
Yeah.
And it turned into this like beautiful conversation of like, you don't think there were moments where I was like lying awake at night while you were sleeping and, shedding tears and having all this turmoil. And so I think that open line of communication is incredibly important, can be very eye-opening for both parties.
It's so important. And I think culturally, thanks to Brene Brown, probably, and others, vulnerability is an important thing to talk about. It's also an important value. I would say in a lot of men, we haven't really gotten the message yet that vulnerability is really healthy, right? Like, it's really important. And many men haven't picked up the message yet that when you're weak, that's when you're really strong, right? Like when you're weak, you're strong. When I grew up in Michigan, there were a lot of tornadoes. And what I often noticed was that if a tree was big and sturdy, the wind would knock it down. But if it was flexible and could bend, that tree would weather a storm or two and it would still be standing. And I think that's how we are often as people, right? Like if we're planting our feet and flexing our muscles, doing that all the time, that wind of trauma is going to knock us over. If we can be vulnerable and bend, we're often going to be better in the long haul.
Switching gears to someone living with a terminal disease or a metastatic cancer, right? And where this trauma doesn't necessarily have the luxury of, oh, I finished treatment or today was my last day of chemotherapy. I can quote unquote like move on, so to speak, which is its own other crazy topic. But when you're living with something where maybe your life expectancy has been truncated, when the statistics are dire and prognosis is dire, but we also see in the breast cancer setting that medicines are evolving and people are living well beyond the prognosis, I would say. But how does medical trauma show up and manifest in that setting? And what are some of the tools that people could utilize when they know that they're trying to live while they're also acknowledging death?
This moves us back to what I would call the both andness of things, that I'm facing death and I'm trying to live a rich life in the process. I'm trying to do both of those together. And that's no simple thing, right? Like nobody would suggest that's a simple thing. And we do have models where that's possible. I'm in Music City, USA, I guess is what people call Nashville. And there's this famous song, you might remember it, written by Craig Wiseman, sung by Tim McGraw, Live Like You're Dying. Do you remember that song? Do you know that song? Yeah, you should look it up. I tried to mention it in my book. Evidently, there are licensing fees when you list a song in a book, but the lyrics basically are tell a story of a man who develops cancer and he looks it in the eye at the terminal situation. And one of the lyrics says, I spoke sweeter, I became the kind of friend a friend should be. I climbed a mountain, I rode on a bull. Some of it's a little stereotypic. People don't celebrate getting terminal illness, right? Like I understand. Yet, the song is a beautiful picture of what we call post-traumatic growth. And the message of post-traumatic growth is not that your cancer is not traumatic. It is, though, that even in the midst of hard things, there may be a way to find some beauty. There may be a way to find some beauty. And often that beauty takes the form of some degree of different engagement with something transcendent. Sometimes people lean into faith a little more. Sometimes people lean into relationships a little more. Sometimes people enjoy a little more, watching the ducks swim around in a pond. Right now, I'm not a big believer in what people call hopium. Hopium is a term that was coined during the during the pandemic, mixing hope with opium. So, like, there are no rainbows and unicorns coming for you, right? In the form of a terminal cancer, it's really difficult. There's no disputing it, right? But with the right mental health support, there is, I think, a way to live bravely, to find meaning, even as hard things are happening. And, I haven't had terminal cancer, far from it, but I did develop obsessive compulsive disorder in my late 40s, a mental illness that is pretty severe for many people, is pretty severe, and it was for me. And for a long time, my thought was, if I could just get rid of this OCD, which I didn't ask for and I don't want, then my life would be fine. It would be fine if I could just get rid of my OCD. And I went to see my psychologist. And for the first year or so of seeing her, probably 52 times, that was the only conversation I had. Let's get rid of the OCD. And she said at some point, Jim, we're not getting rid of the OCD, right? Like, we're not getting rid of it. Maybe you can find a way to live a meaningful life with it. And my first response was, that's not happening, right? Like, other people can do that. I'm not doing that. We're getting rid of the OCD. And you see some parallels, I think, acknowledging their differences. You see some parallels where people have gone to Mexico and they've gone to Eastern Europe and they've pursued every cancer cure there is, right? In the hopes that they could get rid of it. Again, not equating cancer to OCD. And at a certain point, I thought, my OCD is not going away. Evidently, it's not. Can I find a way to thrive even as I'm living with OCD? And when I started entertaining that, my life really began to change. So again, I don't want to overstate the parallel here, but I do want to invite people to consider that even if my situation vis-a-vis my cancer is not the one I want, and even if this is leading me to places where I don't want to go, is there a way that I can try to find some meaning, not necessarily in the cancer? I don't have to pretend that it was a good thing, but is there a way I can find some meaning in my life and recognize that I can live a valuable, meaningful life, even as it's a terminal situation? And a psychologist can help with that. It's no simple thing. It's a very sad situation, but a psychologist can help with that. Does that make sense?
It does. And I like that you're tying this into enabling us and giving us permission to seek that professional help and to say that we don't have to do this alone. We don't have to, come up with the answers ourselves. And even in your example, I appreciate that it didn't happen overnight. Like, over 52 weeks of just talking of, like, we need to move in this other direction before you could accept what the situation was. We need support to get us there.
Yeah, it took so long for me, really. Year one, that was in 2018, I guess. And I think probably a couple years ago, I got to the place where I thought, oh my gosh, I'm actually doing really well with this. But it took a long time. And it does take a long time. On my desk here, I've got a little bottle. You can see this. This is Dr. Pierce's compound. Dr. Pierce, R.V. Pierce, was a famous physician and infamous physician in Buffalo, New York, around the turn of the century. And he sold these supposed cures for everything from cancer to rheumatology related problems to gout, to you name it. This was supposed to fix everything, Dr. Pierce's compound. And I keep it on my desk because it's a reminder for me that things don't work that way, right? Like, there often is no magic pill, right? There often is no magic bullet. Now, we can be hugely grateful that in cancer, there are hugely effective treatments, right? That's such a blessing. It's so beautiful. But the point related to the no magic pill is, even though that cancer has been cured, it still leaves a mark, right? It still leaves an emotional mark. And I don't know that we figured out how to cure that yet, right? Like, it still causes anxiety every time someone goes back for their annual scan, right? And it still causes pain when someone says, gosh, when my daughter was in high school and I couldn't be at the prom because I was getting treatment at MD Anderson and I missed all these milestones, I feel like such a failure as a mom, feel so ashamed. Like, we can't cure that, right? People have to process that. So I think it's a really important message. There are reasons to be hopeful. There are reasons to be empowered. There are great things on the horizon, but it's still really hard. And it would be lovely if we could take a magic elixir and all these problems would go away, but that's not the world that we live in.
I like the term, I wrote it down over here, the post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
I haven't heard that one yet, but I'm going to start using that. And I think that really sums up that, yes, that we can go through something traumatic. We can be living in something traumatic, but there are opportunities for finding that joy, finding that meaning, and having personal growth as a result.
I think it's so important. Probably 15 years ago, and one of the benefits of getting old, by the way, is you realize, oh gosh, this story is from 25 years ago. I'm so old. This one, not 25, 15, but probably 15 years ago, I was giving a lecture at a hospital in New Mexico in Albuquerque. It was a lecture that was funded by a woman who had lost her husband, actually due to cancer, due to the effects of cancer. And I was talking in that meeting about post-traumatic growth. That was the topic. And I referenced this phase from the Old Testament that you might be familiar with, this phrase, trading beauty for ashes, right? This idea that you've got these ashes and they're replaced by beauty, this popular phrase in the Old Testament. And I mentioned it. I said something about beauty for ashes. And I told a story, talked about post-traumatic growth, and we went to dinner, the speakers after the conference. And the woman who funded it, she's a lovely person, she sat next to me and she said, that was a really interesting phrase you used, beauty for ashes. And she said, you might be surprised to know that that's my email address, beauty for ashes 65 at, Comcast.net or what, not using her actual email, right? But it was something like that, beauty for ashes. And she went on to tell this story about the profound pain that the death of her husband caused. And she went on to talk with great sincerity about how her life had been transformed in beautiful ways as a result, in unexpected ways. And I think, the wrong approach, the absolute wrong approach is to say, oh gosh, don't cry, don't worry. This is an opportunity for growth. It's amazing, right? Like that would be so absurdly cruel to try to highlight that. I would never do that. I would hope no one would do that. With time, though, to invite people to consider that the struggle they've been through can lead to changes in their life in deep places, that's something that resonates with people, because many people will say, I had it happen not long ago in Montana in a Lyft, in a car with a Lyft driver. Many people will say, in the case of this gentleman, I had a heart attack, I had a cardiac arrest, and I should have died, and I didn't. And I was this big corporate exec, and I was living this, 24/7 sort of fueled by steroids sort of a life. And I had this heart attack, and it made me reconsider what was really important, right? And again, I never force this on people, but when it happens organically, when someone realizes, what I've learned in my cancer journey is that things are not really that important, but people are, right? There's some beauty in that. And those insights can be very therapeutic, I think.
Thank you for sharing that. There's so much that resonates, I know, with me personally and with our community, because we have these conversations all the time, that when you're diagnosed with cancer, whether it be early stage or especially metastatic disease, your time is the commodity, and who you decide to spend that time with, who you want to surround yourself with, is that gift that you're giving to people.
Right.
And so it definitely shifts that perspective of what's important and finding that meaning that you were mentioning.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, there's a famous saying, I have no idea who said it, but I used to hear it a lot. And that saying was, people don't care how much you know till they know how much you care. All right. I love that phrase. And to me, as a healthcare provider, the relevance of that is, I might have some insights. Maybe I do. I think I do. But I might have some insights about how you could find ways to cope better on the heels of cancer or in the throes of cancer. I might have some insights. Those insights, though, in my mind, are not going to be necessarily received by you until you understand that I really care deeply about you, right? So we can't put the cart in front of the horse. I think healthcare providers need to recognize, sure, I've got specialized training in oncology or pediatric oncology or whatever. I might be triple board certified. I went to Dana-Farber, MD Anderson, Vanderbilt, wherever. But that knowledge might not be of great use unless I communicate to this person that I'm going to treat you with great dignity and I'm going to treat you with great humanity. And I'm not going to dismiss your concerns because I happen to think that you shouldn't be so worried, right? There might be all sorts of reasons why you're worried. And once you recognize that I have a deep affinity and care for you, only then, in my mind, should I expect that you're going to listen to what I have to say.
So let me ask you about this book that you've made a few references to. Tell me about your book. What is it called? Where can people find it? And tell me more about what it's about.
Yeah, thanks. It's called Reclaiming Your Life from Medical Trauma. That's the short title. It follows, but I think for our purposes, we can call it Reclaiming Your Life from Medical Trauma. And excuse me, has been published by Little Brown Publishing House in New York City, and it's out April 28th. It's available on Amazon. It will be in Barnes and Nobles and various other bookstores, independent bookstores, I think, around the country. And it's really motivated by what we discussed at the beginning of this conversation. And that is that, to me, there's this gigantic public health problem, medical trauma, that no one is talking about and that many people have never even heard of, right? Like, many people have not heard the term medical trauma, even as really thoughtful people like you were not familiar with the term post-traumatic growth, right? Like, we've got a little bit of a branding problem, I think, with these terms. And in my work at Vanderbilt, dating back to 2001, the common theme that I have seen as I've encountered huge numbers of patients of all kinds is that their medical illness and their experience with healthcare providers, it has left a mark. It leaves a mark. And, that's true in everything from an unexpected emergency C-section to a surgery that goes badly, to a complicated critical illness, to cancer, to being diagnosed with a chronic illness that you didn't want, but you've got, and everything in between. Like, all these experiences, they leave a mark. And I've been mindful of the fact that with veterans, for instance, I work at the VA. With veterans, conversations about PTSD and trauma are front and center. You see them everywhere, as you should. And with medical populations, you see these conversations about trauma exactly nowhere. They really don't exist. And so my book was really written to be a kind and hopeful and affirming guide. The goal was, let's come alongside readers, let's give this problem a name, and then let's provide a path for them to find some healing in the context of hope. Hope, I think, is so important, right? Not the form of just drink this elixir 3 times a day, everything will be fine, but hope in the form of people can thrive in the midst of hugely hard things, right? If you surround yourself with community, if you lean into meaning, if you find the right treatment, if all those things happen, there are reasons to be often hugely hopeful. And so that's what the book's about. You send books out to people. I don't know if you know how this works, but you want people to write on the back of your book, right? Like, this book's amazing, right? Like, you want that to happen. So you send all these requests into the ether, and you hope that some people will say, I'm going to endorse your book. And maybe they will, maybe they won't. And of course, I found people to endorse my book. But one of the things that has been the most encouraging as I've gotten these endorsements is the comment, this book is really practical. This is practical. And I think in academics, and I've written 150 papers or 200 or whatever, many of my Harvard colleagues written far more than that, but I, I've been in this academic arena for a long time. And, the accusation, fair or unfair, about physician scientists or psychologists who are scientists or whatever is, well, this is theoretical stuff. It's not very practical. And so to me, this book had to be practical, meaning I want you to pick up a book, whatever the book is, in this case, my book, and I want you to figure out a roadmap to engage in this process of healing. And I think it is very practical. It's packed with patient stories, very empowering. I think it's really hopeful. I would tell your listeners, if they have questions about medical trauma based on the book, send me an email. Send me an email. I'm not hard to find. I'll respond to everyone. We've got some resources at Vanderbilt that we offer. We have a medical trauma support group, which I think is hugely helpful. If there's a healthcare provider or two that is listening, and if they wanted to step one up, I'd be happy to help them figure that out. So really, it's just meant to be a resource because there isn't one. And I pray that it will impact the lives of a lot of people, including many of your listeners.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I love the practical aspect because so many times we can hear the theory or we know what we're supposed to do, but then you're left with, well, how do I do this? How do I do this in my daily life? We're busy, we're moms, we're dealing with treatment, et cetera. Like, how do I actually take action to be able to move the needle? So I'm excited for your book. I can't wait to pick up a copy. I might have to ask for a signed copy from you, but we'll go from there.
There's this construct that everybody remembers from Psychology 101, maybe, and that construct is called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do you remember that? There's a triangle, and food and safety is at the food and safety is at the bottom, and something that he called self-actualization. Nobody uses that word anymore, but that's at the top. And the point is, when people are in the throes of a crisis, of a trauma, they're trying to take care of their very most basic needs. And they often are in the throes of what you might call brain fog. And they're often having a hard time focusing. And they're often not necessarily well equipped to be doing Google searches on everything and anything. And the goal would be for people in the throes of that, here's a book, right? Here's a book that includes a lot of actionable information, and it's going to be very accessible. And that's really important. I use a lot of analogies involving food. I don't know what that says to me, but I do. And really the goal here is we're going to put the cookies not on the top shelf, but we're going to put the cookies on the lower shelf where you can easily reach them. That's what this book tries to do.
I love that. Well, Dr. Jackson, I really appreciate today's conversation, you sharing your wisdom, teaching me new terms that I haven't used before. I think it's so helpful when we can actually say, like, yes, that's exactly what I've been trying to say or pinpoint or articulate. And so we will go from here. Thank you for your time.
Keep up your good work.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to our show. I would like to acknowledge that all of the information on our podcast is from personal experiences and is not a substitute for professional medical advice. You should always contact your medical care team. If you are looking for specific topics or would like to be a guest on our show, please feel free to reach out. My email is laura@survivingbreastcancer.org. Our show is made possible by our nonprofit, survivingbreastcancer.org, and by our incredible donors like yourself. You can hop on over to survivingbreastcancer.org to sign up for our mailing list, make a donation, and explore the 400 plus programs we offer each year at survivingbreastcancer.org/events. Until next time, keep on thriving.